Rhonda Pick, Managing Editor of Pig Health Today, and with me is Dr. Jim Kober. He is a water quality consultant. Jim, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, Rhonda. Thank you.
In your role as a water quality consultant, you work with producers to assess water quality in their operations. Why is it important to assess water quality?
Well, what we find in a lot of older buildings in particular, and sometimes newer buildings, is that you get biofilm built up in the water lines. That biofilm is a really good media for bacteria to grow in. And over time, it gets worse. Some farms will have iron in the water, and that'll constrict the water flow as well as affect intake. So we're testing water and trying to figure out what the best course of action on each farm is.
What are some typical signs producers should look for that they might be encountering a water quality challenge?
Well, one thing we see is just low flow. Over time, it seems like flow of the water gets less, pressure gets less. They have a break in the water line. They look in there. It might be a coating of rust. It might be a slimy coat of biofilm. And they wonder what that is. And obviously, if that stuff is growing in the water line or the rust is accumulating, that's going to affect both water flow and in turn livestock performance.
How often do you recommend people are checking their water quality and sending it into a lab and getting it tested?
You know, water is an important nutrient, so I would suggest they test their water as often as they're testing their feed. And particularly if they're having a problem that doesn't make sense, that they've done a lot of diagnostics on a farm with a particular problem and can't really get to the bottom of it. If they haven't checked the water, that's a good place to look, because sometimes the water will taste bad to the animals, or the flow is bad that it'll actually affect performance.
What kind of information does a water quality test reveal? What does a panel of tests look like that people are getting done?
Well, the panel that I like to do has 10 or 11 different things. It starts with pH of the water, and then it has nutrient or micronutrients in it, calcium, sodium, manganese, magnesium, chloride, fluoride, but it also checks for coliform, or at least I would suggest that the water sample is thorough enough that it tests coliform. Many of the water samples are quite high in pH and has a lot of iron in it. That iron will build up in the pipes over time, and the pH will actually negatively affect intake. About half the time when we sample, we'll find coliforms are growing in there. It doesn't specify whether that's E. coli or salmonella, but obviously coliforms are bad. And particularly in neonates and newly weaned animals is where it's particularly important that the water be clean and not have coliforms. So I've seen nurseries with E. coli scours after weaning, and lo and behold, we find that there's actually coliforms in the water. So coliforms is an important one, along with those other minerals and pH.
What target pH are you looking for?
We would like swine to be under 7, so between 6.5 and 7. That seems to be where the water tastes the best to the pigs. And also, if it's higher than that, then that allows more bacteria to grow. So if you can get the pH under 7, that will help reduce the bacterial load in the water.
If you're a producer and you've identified that you've got buildup in your water lines, what are some actions that you should be taking?
Well, if it's just biofilm and not a lot of iron, then there are products out there that will cleanse the water line, and some of them are made specifically when the buildings are empty. So an all-in, all-out finisher, or all-in, all-out even by room. Some products are also okay with animals in the building at a much lower rate. That will take a lot longer to thoroughly clean those water lines if you're running it with animals because of the dilution. So the first thing is to clean the water lines out. If we find out through the water test that there's an ongoing problem, say with iron or sulfates or something like that, then we may have to treat continuously so the water stays good.
You mentioned previously that flow rates can be impacted by clogging in the water lines. What should a target flow rate be?
On our pork quality assurance assessments, we would like to see with sows, mature sows, at about a quart a minute water flow. The other species, I'm not quite as familiar with that, but if we can get a quart a minute to sows, that's good.
When you submit water quality samples to the laboratory, how long does it typically take to get results?
Depends on the lab and depends on how many things you're testing for. It's not as quick as a diagnostic test going to an animal diagnostic lab. It usually takes between a week and 10 days before we get those back.
When you typically run water quality tests and you collect samples on farm, are you collecting from multiple different points on the farm, or what does that process look like from a best practice standpoint?
What we like to do is start at the well, or as close to the well as we can, to make sure that the water coming into the barn or up from the well is good quality. Then we like to go to the farthest point away from the well to see what happens in between. So that's on a single site finishing barn. That's easy. You just go to the end of the barn. If you're talking about a conventional farrow to finish with all ages, then we might take a sample in the sow barn, in the farrowing house, in the nursery, and in the finisher, just to see what might be going on throughout the barn there.
What final advice would you have for producers who are interested in improving water quality in their operation?
Well, first they need to test so we know what we're dealing with. Iron is a problem and pH is a problem. The next step after you get the results back depends on what it is. We can shock the well. If the well looks really bad, that's not a good long-term solution. We can clean the water lines themselves, which would be the next step. Try to clean them out when the pigs aren't there. And then a final step would be if the pigs can't be moved, like a big gestation barn or something, we can meter some products in at a slower rate so they can do it right with the animals in there.